Fumito Ueda graduated from the Osaka University of Arts in 1993 and began his career in the video games industry in 1995. The first job he got was working on Enemy Zero for the Sega Saturn as an animator, but according to that game's director Kenji Ino, this wasn't where his talents really lay. Speaking in September 2008, Ino said of Ueda's application, "I still remember the work that he submitted. His technology as an animator, as a CG artist, wasn't that great, but his ideas and his concepts really struck me, so even though he originally wasn't on the hiring list, I handpicked him because I saw his potential." And a quarter of a century later, I think it's fair to say that Ino's assessment was a good one. Ueda left Warp in 1997, just a year and a half later. This was the year when he started working for Sony and began working on what would be his first video game creation. Ueda wanted to make something that was different to all the video games that had come before. Something innovative, ambitious, a game that would stand the test of time. And boy was he successful. In 2001 his debut game released, and that game was NICO. Despite receiving the major backing of a Sony publishing campaign, NICO sold fairly poorly. In particular in North America, where the early release date led to the box looking like this, rather than having the incredible Giorgio de Chirico inspired cover drawn by Ueda himself before the game's release in Japan and Europe. This. Let's not talk about this. By 2009, NICO had sold just 700,000 copies worldwide. And to put that in context, the slightly disappointing Wrath of Cortex, released just a month later, sold a similar figure in its first year, and Grand Theft Auto 3 sold 3 times that number in its first 4 months. NICO wasn't a commercial product, it was a passion project. And critically, NICO was incredibly well received, commanding immeasurable praise from those in the industry, those in games media, and aspiring developers. Jokingly and fondly referred to as the most influential video game you never played, NICO's legacy is still felt today. NICO was a puzzle platformer about a young boy called NICO imprisoned in a castle and left to die for the crime of having been born with horns. It's a game about solving spatial puzzles and climbing broken architecture, pulling levers, pushing boxes, watching barriers rise and drawbridges lower. It's a game about NICO trying to escape the castle and in the process save a young girl he meets called Yorda. But at the same time, it's not. Sure, it has those things, but none of them ever feel like the focus. Ueda wanted to create a video game unlike any before, and he did. NICO isn't a game about its mechanics, or its gameplay, or its plot. It's a game about its 2 characters, NICO and Yorda, and the relationship the player builds between them as the game does everything it can to stay out of your way. At the start of the video here, it's also worth mentioning that NICO was originally released on the PlayStation 2 in 2001, but a lot of the footage in this video, and the game I initially replayed while writing it, is the HD remaster of the game that was released in 2011 on the PlayStation 3. That edition also featured one of Ueda's more niche titles that you probably haven't heard of as extra bonus content. It's always worth looking at remakes and remasters critically, because when you re-roll the dice on a previously successful formula, it's possible for a game to lose a certain je ne sais quoi that made the title worth revisiting in the first place. Fortunately, this is usually more of a problem in remakes than remasters, and for NICO the remastered version on the PlayStation 3 is, in my mind, the way to play the game. While NICO was still special on its original release, though being a small child at the time I didn't play it for a few years, the PlayStation 2 hardware simply wasn't good enough to do the visuals and the world of NICO justice. Team NICO pushed that console to its limits, and as a result the game originally ran at a lower resolution than most other PlayStation 2 titles, and still suffered from fairly severe frame rate drops. The remaster is an all-round improvement, with new high-definition visuals at a consistent 30 frames per second while leaving the gameplay untouched. And just to add slightly more confusion, the footage in this video is the HD remaster streamed through PlayStation Now, and so there were occasional but rare stutters, but those were the fault of playing a game across the internet rather than an issue with the game itself. Anyway. The game starts with a fairly lengthy opening cutscene, with a minute leading up to the game's gorgeous start menu, and 5.5 minutes between starting the game and taking control of its eponymous character. This video isn't just going to be a long plot summary, but I will quickly describe the opening cutscene. In this cutscene, 2 soldiers and a cloaked figure lead a young boy with horns on horseback towards a castle. Reaching a cliff edge, they continue by boat, with no bridge leading towards the castle's main gate. The bright colour palette immediately turns dark and gloomy. A large glowing sword acts as a key to open a totem door into a room surrounded by dark stone objects. As one opens up, the boy is placed inside, hands in a pillory, and the stone is closed. Do not be angry, you're told in a fictional language. This is for the good of the village. It isn't specifically stated yet, but it seems clear from the helmets the guards wear that the reason you've been brought here is the horns on your head, and that locking you away to die is a superstition. And there's also the ominous notion that this likely isn't the first time this has happened. The walls are lined with stone tombs identical to the one you've been placed in. How many children have been brought here? Fortunately, as the guards leave and descend back through the same elevator, the motion of the floor shakes the foundations of the castle, and due to some damage to stone, your tomb falls forward and cracks open, allowing you to escape. Unconscious on the floor, Iko sees a vision of a dark creature trapped high up in a cage before being grasped by shadows from a wall behind him. And finally, after a captivating 6.5 minutes of introductory cutscene, Iko lets you play. The premise is immediately clear without any need for instruction. You were trapped in a stone tomb, now you need to escape. Iko's general design is a puzzle platformer, a game where figuring out how to move from A to B is the core of the gameplay. The defining feature of the room where you begin is a large staircase, so naturally you'll likely explore this way first. At the top of the stairs is a lever. Pull the lever, it opens a door. Through the door, a chain hangs from the ceiling. Climb the chain, leap across to a higher platform and into the bottom of a tall tower. Climb a ladder, up the stairs, keep exploring. This curved staircase looks eerily familiar to the vision you had a few moments earlier, and as you work your way to the top of the broken stairs and towards the cage, it triggers another cutscene. It might seem at this point that Ico is a game that uses cinematic cutscenes frequently to build its story, but we'll see later how that couldn't be further from the truth. Depending on how you define individual cutscenes, you would get a different number for how many there are, but I think a useful way to count it is how many sections of the story are told through cutscenes. In terms of these narrative cutscenes, ones which contain some form of dialogue or plot progression, and don't just show the mechanical effects of a lever or switch, Ico only uses these 6 times, including the introduction and the end of the game. This here is the second of them, and it just so happens to occur in the first 15 minutes. This cutscene is a repeat of Ico's dream, but now we can see that in reality the girl in the cage is a pale, ghostly white, in stark contrast to what he envisioned. You find a way to let her down using another mechanical switch, and when her cage crashes to the floor, the 2 characters, Ico and Yorda, finally meet. Their introduction is cut short by a shadowy creature emerging from the ground to snatch Yorda away. Grabbing at a wooden stick from the floor, you swing at the shadow monster until it drops Yorda and disappears. It's taken just 15 minutes, but Ico has established its background, its characters, its enemies, its goal, and its core puzzle design. From here, Ico is all about you and Yorda finding a way to traverse the puzzles of the level design. The game has already demonstrated that its gameplay is about realistic platforming with tangible puzzles. Things like switches and boxes and chains, which are physical objects that exist in the real world, and this approach keeps Ico grounded. It's always been important to Ueda that puzzles don't feel arbitrary. And it's one of the reasons that he loves using old stone buildings with damaged architecture as the settings for his games. Not only are stone castles heavily atmospheric and naturally bring with them ideas of impenetrable walls and inescapable dungeons, but when you see a broken bridge or sealed door blocking your way, it makes sense in the context of the location. The player doesn't wonder why the character can't just take a simple route. Why has the floor given way? Because the castle is old. Why are the drawbridges raised? Because that's how castles use them. This lets NICO guide players to take more complex routes without feeling illogical or having the need for immersion breaking invisible walls. The gameplay is all about exploring the 3D space and finding a route from A to B. But this is only the first half of the puzzle. NICO has some talent when it comes to this, climbing chains with ease and pulling off various feats of athleticism throughout, but Yorda is the opposite. Her movement is far more limited. While she can climb on boxes, she can't push them around like NICO can. Climbing chains is beyond her, and so is shimmying along walls. She can clamber up some heights and across some larger gaps, but only with help from NICO on the other side. If Yorda is going to follow you, there needs to be an easier path for her to take, and that is the second half of NICO's gameplay, opening doors and creating paths so that Yorda can also traverse the broken architecture of the castle. The relationship is clear. NICO has all the dexterity and strength, and without him the two of you are going nowhere. But Yorda has a different skill. Yorda holds the key to opening the totem doors. It's not a physical key like the sword wielded by the guards in the opening cutscene, but rather an innate and mysterious magical power that Yorda already possesses. Without NICO you won't reach these doors, and without Yorda you won't get through them. It's instilled early on, and importantly through the gameplay, that these two characters are important to one another. Because you played the game as NICO, your control over Yorda is largely indirect. The dialogue in the game is all spoken in a fictional language. This helps with making the world feel strange and alien to the player, and from a practical standpoint also greatly reduce the difficulty of localization. There are subtitles for you to understand the characters during cutscenes. However, while NICO's lines have subtitles translated to your language, Yorda's don't. When Yorda speaks, the subtitles appear as a series of fictional hieroglyphs. NICO and Yorda don't speak the same language. NICO can't understand what Yorda is saying, and so you can't either, keeping the player seeing the world through the same perspective as the character they control. Because you can't fully communicate with Yorda, you have to take a much simpler approach. You can shout to get Yorda's attention for her to come to you, or you can lead her around the castle by hand. The game always tries to use mechanics and gameplay to tell its story and build its characters, and what better way is there to keep the player thinking about Yorda and building a connection between her and NICO than having them in the middle of the screen, at the centre of the player's attention, holding each other's hand. Holding Yorda's hand is also an active mechanic, so for NICO to hold her hand, you have to be actively holding it via the R1 button. Speaking of holding hands, you can tell I put effort into these segues. This is one thing that NICO, the game, doesn't do. It gives you no tutorials and instead has a focus on keeping the player in the moment and sharing the perspective of the protagonist they control. And this means no help messages, no waypoints or directions, no mission menu. In fact, NICO has no heads-up display at all, a design decision inspired by the 1991 platformer Another World. There isn't anything fourth wall breaking to distract you, and everything you need to see as a player is something that NICO can see in the game, and this is all for immersion. Ueda wants his players to be searching the world his team created rather than making a beeline for objectives or following a dotted line. Not only does this design choice build into the story and character driven game design, but as a puzzle platformer it makes NICO immensely satisfying. Finding your way out of a tricky situation has an element of personal achievement. By being free of common gamifying features, Every room or area is a real place that the player needs to move through, and so the path that you take always feels like something you discovered, rather than a predetermined solution to a set puzzle. There are a few exceptions, of course. It's hard to make pushing a box onto a button affect any response other than, they want me to move that there, and that was true in 2001 as well, but overall, NICO is a game that encourages its players to explore, and then rewards them for their effort. But just because there's no heads-up display or arrows to direct you, doesn't mean that players are completely on their own. Instead, NICO guides you in a natural and immersive way through solid level design and clever visuals. It gives you hints, not verbally or written, but through mechanics and context. In the first playable section of the game, NICO builds player confidence by using a very linear design. Literally, it's just a staircase that doesn't give you anywhere else to go. It's telling players to try out the mechanics by using everything they can see and immediately rewarding them for it. By building confidence in this way, players eventually know that when they see a box that can be pushed over a ledge, that action isn't going to force an impossible fail state. So seeing an opportunity like this will immediately get a player thinking about why. If that box goes over that ledge, what does that let me do next? Where does that let me move to? This might be all it takes for a puzzle to start to solve itself, but it never takes away from a player's satisfaction for having solved it. And it isn't just the boxes that do this. Almost every mechanic in the game encourages players to use it now and see how it helps them. If there's a chain that you can climb up, there's no downside to seeing what's up there. If there's a ledge you can shimmy across, it's worth checking out what's on the other side. If the game presents you with a lever, pull it. This monkey see, monkey do attitude that NICO encourages may sound childish when I deliberately tried to make it sound like that by bringing monkeys into it, but really what it is an acceptance of pure gameplay. Ueda understood that if a player sees a chain that they can climb, then they're going to want to climb it. And rewarding players for that encourages exploration and interaction, which is not only what makes a game like this fun, but also leads players towards their goals without ever needing to take them out of the game. There are a couple of other ways that Team NICO guided their players without breaking immersion. Clear visual design is one of them. The boxes that I've mentioned a couple of times always have the same appearance no matter where they are, and so always stand out as something that players can and should interact with. If something slightly new is introduced, like the ability to climb up pipes, it's going to be in an empty environment where the pipe clearly stands out from the wall behind it, or the pipe will widen and run along the ground so that it simply can't be missed by the players. NICO also uses a scripted camera, which I love. It's definitely my favourite way for an art game to approach its camera design. And as an aside, if camera design in video games is something you've never thought about but now you're wondering why, there's a great talk by John Nesky who worked on Journey all about camera design in games. It focuses more on practical aspects for game developers and how he writes the code for his cameras, but it is interesting nevertheless. Not only does a scripted camera allow a game to show off its stunning visuals and produce wonderful cinematic moments during gameplay, this one towards the end of the game being one of my favourites, it also lets the game guide a player by keeping any key objects or locations in the frame, like ledges to climb on, or bringing a chain into the foreground. Scripting the camera can also be great for gameplay, like in that clip. The camera shows NICO moving along the walkway, rotates to line up NICO with the chain to better visualise the jump, and then swings back around to show the player the arc of their movement. Sure, this is something you could do with a manual camera, but there's something to be said for keeping the player focused on the character while the game worries about the cinematography in the background. But you do have the option to make NICO look around a room if you need it, and pivot a slightly more zoomed in camera with the right analog stick to search for new places to go. There are two moments in the game where this scripted camera performs a hard cut at an awkward moment that can lead you to almost walking NICO off the map, but these are very much the exceptions. Any new mechanics, of which there aren't many due to Ueda's famous design philosophy that I'm deliberately not bringing up yet, in case you're wondering why I still haven't said those 3 magic words, are introduced with smart tutorials. Subtle, invisible tutorials. Invisible tutorials are common, bordering on ubiquitous now, but I still can't think of many games that pull them off as elegantly as NICO. Probably the most complex of NICO's mechanics are the bombs that you use at a few points during the game. To do this, the player needs to recognise the bombs, know that they can pick one up, find a suitable location to place it, realise that they can light the wooden stick they use to fight off the shadow creatures, and then light the fuse with the flaming stick. Making the bombs recognisable is easy, with Ico using an almost cartoony style with a circular shape and a rope fuse sticking out of the top. When the bombs are first used, they're found unmissably next to the only entrance to a large but barren chamber, and inside the chamber there are a few distinguishing features. Mostly it matches the dark, shadowy nature of the rest of the castle, but there's a candle chandelier still burning after you earlier broke it from the ceiling, and a single, large, visibly damaged pillar. All the player has to puzzle with are bombs, fire, a half-broken pillar, and some wooden sticks. A combination that any basic video game literacy will tell a player, even if not immediately, that it's time for an explosion. And it was conveyed entirely through the design of a single room and a doorway. And when the player understands the new mechanics, the game can get more creative with them. Just place bombs in a new setting, and the player will instinctively head out and look for something that looks like it could be broken. If a section of the game still has you stumped, then as a final little prompt, Yorda will occasionally call out something in her strange language. She can't give any detail because of the language barrier between the two characters, but she can gesture at a box or a ledge as though she's asking Ico to do something with it. And I think it's nice that the closest Ico dares get to communicating directly with the player and breaking the fourth wall is still just having one of its two main characters communicate with the other. Because of the lack of hand-holding, I'm going to keep using that terrible joke, the gameplay style that Ico encourages is one of exploration, constantly moving around to search for new places to go and ways to escape. A lot of the initial exploration in each area can only be done alone, as Yorda can't climb or jump to the same places that you can, so at times this means leaving her alone in the castle, but this comes at a risk. The shadow creatures that attacked her in the opening cutscene are still here, and they still want Yorda. If the opportunity arises, the shadow creatures will try to take her. This puts a huge weight of pressure on you every time you leave her alone. There's always a timer ticking in your mind knowing that you can't get delayed for too long. You can't get lost or try to do too much without finding a way back to her, and it gives the game a great layer of tension that builds on the unsettling atmosphere of the castle throughout the puzzle platforming. More importantly though, it keeps Yorda with you wherever you are, figuratively speaking. The hand-holding mechanic is in the game to get players to start caring about Yorda, and now, even when you leave her alone, she's still going to be on your mind. You're worried where she is, you're worried that you might not find a way back quickly enough. You're keeping a mental map of the path you've taken so that if you hear the terrifying gasp of her being grabbed by a monster, you'll be able to retrace your steps as quickly as possible. I said that this wasn't a game that's about its mechanics, that it's a game about the relationship between its two characters, and this is just another way that that relationship is developed for the player. Yorda has been made important to you by her skill set, brought into focus by the hand-holding and how she fits into the puzzle design, and kept in your mind even when off-screen by the looming threat of the shadow creatures. She's not just some side character or companion, she feels like a person in actual danger and who desperately needs your help. Whenever I had to leave her alone for any length of time, panic started building up inside me in a way that no other video game has ever managed to achieve. When the monsters do show up, you see a swirling black hole appear in the floor, and shadow creatures climbing up out of it, which then run, crawl or fly at Yorda with the aim of dragging her down through the portals into their world. When this happens, it's your job to protect her. At first just using the wooden stick you picked up at the start of the game, but later on you find a sword which acts exactly the same as the stick but can kill the shadow creatures in fewer hits. Combat in NICO is very simple. Press square to swing the stick and try to hit the shadow monsters with it. If you hit a monster that's grabbed Yorda, they stumble backwards and drop her. If Yorda has been dragged into a hole, you can grab her hand to pull her out, but if you fail, it's game over. It's also nice that the button you use to grab Yorda's hand and save her is the same button you've been using all game to lead her around the castle, giving that mechanic a nice twist. What's interesting in the combat, before I get onto what really isn't interesting in the combat, is that the monsters really don't care about you. Most of them won't even try to come near you, instead single-mindedly trying to snatch away Yorda. And the ones that do focus on you are still clearly aiming for her. 1 or 2 monsters might stand their ground between you and Yorda, while a third tries to steal her away. It's simple enemy AI, but it's also oddly compelling. It's easy to see that what's happening here is between the shadow creatures and Yorda, a fight between the light and the dark, and really, you're just there. A glitch in the system getting in the way. Even if a monster hits you, they can't ever kill you. The game has no health bar, but what they can do is knock you over. It doesn't lose you health, but it does lose you time. Time that you might need to chase down Yorda and free her from a monster, or time that you might need to pull her out of one of the dark portals in the floor. Your victory isn't tied to a health bar, it's tied to Yorda's survival. Again, the game is always trying to make Yorda important in the mind of the player. Tying the fail state to Yorda is why the combat in NICO is crucial. But it's very basic combat. It's never the focus of the game, and the aim of the fights isn't even to defeat all the enemies, it's just to keep Yorda alive. So sometimes it isn't even necessary to attack. If you can get Yorda to a totem door during a fight, the magic she uses to open them also kills off the creatures. It's a nice addition because the combat, well, it's not brilliant. It's not the focus of the game, which is one reason it's been kept so simple. The other being that, unlike many other video game protagonists, there is no reason for NICO to have any combat skills. One-button combat is fine for a game that is first and foremost a platformer, especially when that aspect of the game is so solid. But in fights, it usually starts off against a handful of enemies at a time, and there's a balancing act between keeping the creatures away from Yorda and finishing off the ones you've already started fighting. But as their numbers start to deplete and you're fighting the shadows individually, the pacing of the combat falls apart completely. There can be a lot of waiting for creatures to get back up after being knocked down, waiting for creatures to stop hiding 2 miles away and fly close enough to be attacked, or waiting for the final enemy to climb up out of its portal. And this can at times drag a fight on for multiple minutes longer than it really needed to take. The simplicity is what a lot of people don't like about NICO's combat, but for me the major issue is this pacing. It is without a doubt NICO's least polished feature. NICO isn't perfect elsewhere, this is still a 2-decade-old game and even the HD remaster is pushing 10 years old, and naturally there are times when that age still shows, in particular in some of the animations. In the HD version I think that the environments are still spectacular, but elements of NICO's movement are a little janky. When swinging on chains, for example, not only does NICO phase through the chains as he moves back and forth, but it's also quite a stuttery motion. There are also the occasional moments when NICO might clip into a ledge or knock into a bit of air due to an incorrect hitbox. These aren't major details by any means, but they are there. I also recall Mass Effect being criticised for using lengthy elevator rides to mask loading screens. Well, NICO has a long elevator ride, with a loading screen in the middle of it anyway. It's little imperfections here and there, though they are ultimately overwhelmed by the quality everywhere else. If you go into NICO expecting early PlayStation 2 platforming with a coat of high-definition paint, then you will be surprised by how well it still plays outside of the combat, and the game's emotional core is as powerful as ever. But having said that, Ueda released 2 games for the PlayStation 2, NICO in 2001 and another in 2005, which not too long ago got a fully fledged remake to bring the game to current-gen consoles. And with 2021 being the 20th anniversary of NICO's original release, then maybe, but I'm not holding my breath. After a good hour of scaling broken architecture, progressing through the castle and defeating shadow monsters, you finally make it to the castle's main gate and freedom beckons. But that would be far too easy. Just as you're about to escape, the gate starts to close, and we're introduced to the game's main antagonist through the third narrative cutscene. A tall woman with a face that matches Yorda's ghostly complexion but cloaked in the smoky darkness of the shadow creatures you've been fighting. She calls Yorda her daughter and warns you to leave her alone, telling you that Yorda will never be able to leave the castle. When this woman, here known as the Queen, leaves, the gate is closed and you have no choice but to head back into the castle you're trying to escape to find a new way to open it. This part of the game includes the two most puzzle-focused sections, little hub areas clearly enclosed by walls with their own self-contained puzzles. When you arrive at the first, saving the game tells you it's called the East Arena, clearly hinting at and teasing you with the idea of a West Arena that you might be able to visit later. Not that it particularly needed hinting, given that you could just turn the camera to look at it. One of NICO's most iconic features is its incredible interconnected level design. Every part of NICO is connected, just as you'd expect a castle to be. But typically in a video game this would be built as a series of separate rooms and stages only held together by context. But in NICO the entire castle is one fully formed location. Looking out from one section of the game you can see places that you've already been, already explored. And the obvious next step is to realise that if you can see places you've previously encountered, maybe you're also looking at sections you might visit in the future, building your anticipation for what's to come. This interconnected design makes the castle feel vast but also tangible and claustrophobic, because seeing how everything all fits together really emphasises just how much is going on in this one place. But it also brings into sharp focus the fact that you haven't actually gone anywhere. For all your struggles and smooth moves, you're still inside the castle, still trapped, and the gate is still closed. One of the coolest ways to see this interconnectedness, definitely the longest word in this review, fully realised, is this incredible map made by Nomad Colossus, a bit of a legend in the various internet fora surrounding Ueda's work. Thanks to the wonders of emulation and the camera mods that allows, NICO could now be viewed from a different perspective, and the map was built from over 400 pictures painstakingly pieced together and edited. You can see the crane and circular podium from the early game and the cart track on the outskirts of the castle. There's the windmill you have to scale on one side and the water wheel over on the other. And then down here you've got the hub of drawbridges that feel like the heart of the castle, linking all the pieces, and the main gate you've been working so desperately hard to reach. In an interview, Ueda said that the castle was constructed so that hopefully the player would always be aware of its entire structure while playing the game. Ueda wanted the castle to be its own character, to really have something to say in the game and provide more to the story than just a location for everything to happen. Which, to start with, is why the game is located in a castle rather than, say, a mansion or manor house. Castles emanate control, and the idea of not just having to escape a location but having to escape a stone fortification really sets up the challenge NICO and Yorda are facing. But in addition to just its context being a castle, the actual design also deliberately adds to the game's story and theme. Using light as a guiding feature is a common trope, and one that features heavily in NICO, which would be expected given how much we've already seen a light versus shadow vibe. Inside the castle, NICO is dark and shadowy, with little noise except for our own footsteps and breathing. But whenever we travel outside where we want to be, our ultimate goal, the game explodes with colour. The stone of the castle glistens in gold and the grass reflects the sunlight in a blinding haze of greens and yellows. You can feel the rays of sunlight hit your skin so strongly I feel tempted to put on factor 50 just to move NICO outside the castle. Inside bad, outside good is a picture easily painted by the contrasting brightness and colours. The light shows where NICO and Yorda want to be, outside of the castle walls. The effect is exaggerated by the extensive use of bloom lighting, a technique that NICO popularised and was one of the first games to use. and one that quite possibly led to that slightly annoying phase mainstream games went through on 7th generation consoles. We've already seen that NICO can have some glorious art associated with it. The cover released in Europe and Japan is one of the most beautiful game covers that I've seen. As mentioned in the intro, it was actually drawn by Fumito Ueda himself, though greatly inspired by The Nostalgia of the Infinite painted by Giorgio de Chirico, whose work defined the metaphysical movement, making heavy use of contrasting light and shadows in paintings that feel almost terrifying in an unconventional way. And that same feeling, one of a vague and threatening unease, is the same feeling that comes across throughout the castle in NICO. The emptiness of these grand spaces feels very much out of place, especially with just how large the interconnected castle feels when you play. Surely you can't be the only people here, but you are. No matter how many great halls you pass through or machines you activate, there isn't a sign of life, nobody to make use of what's around, even though it's clearly been designed with humans in mind. Instead, what you get are the shadow creatures, ethereal monsters about as far from human life as we can get and posing a threat to you whenever they appear. And what this emptiness does is create a sense of loneliness and isolation, and it pulls NICO and Yorda closer together. The only two people in the entire game, in a castle that's lost all humanity. It's natural that we would want to connect the only two characters that we have. There are no distractions, it's just NICO and Yorda, Yorda and NICO, the dream team working together, but desperately alone. This isolation is only further emphasised by the castle being located on an island, totally cut off from the world that NICO knows. And the incessant noise of waves crashing against the rocks is a constant reminder of that fact. The game's soundtrack is mostly silent, instead preferring an immersive approach where we only hear what NICO hears. His own footsteps, his own breathing, and the crashing of the waves. Music only appears in unnatural moments. The gorgeous track Heal playing across the calm as NICO and Yorda take a moment of rest while saving, and another spooky, erratic track playing to signify the presence of shadow monsters. This is what Ueda wanted the castle to do, to have a distinct feel that works with and amplifies the story the game is trying to tell. But what's more important here is not just how the castle pulls our characters together in a them versus the world tone, but how it does it during the gameplay, allowing the story and bond to develop and unfold naturally without the need for forced dialogue or immersion-breaking cutscenes. Everything in NICO is working towards common goals. From the enemies to the castle to the sounds to the puzzle design feeds into the relationship between NICO and Yorda, or the immersive gameplay that makes that connection more real. And Team NICO achieved this through Fumito Ueda's famous design philosophy. I'm gonna do it. I'm gonna say it. I've managed to avoid it for a long time, but I know you've been waiting for it. Those 3 words. I love it. Design by subtraction is Ueda's famous methodology. Though that name was one he coined after the creation of NICO, the principles it described were core to the game's development. The idea of design by subtraction is to find the essence of a game, to focus in on the heart of what a game is about, and ruthlessly chip away everything that doesn't elevate that core experience. In NICO, the heart of the game is the relationship between NICO and Yorda. In an interview included as one of the bonus features of the PlayStation 3 HD collection, Fumito Ueda, Kenji Kaido, and Junichi Hosono, original members of Team NICO, even talk about some of the mechanics that were trialled and removed. One was a stamina meter that maybe also acted like a health bar. They'd made animations for NICO stumbling and even dying when he was low on energy, but it was later cut out, instead deciding that losing Yorda should be the main fail state, emphasising her importance to the player. When the game did have the stamina meter, Ueda notes that they did create a heads-up display, but when that mechanic was cut, NICO reverted back to the cleaner, Another World-inspired look it eventually released with. At one stage, guards, like the one who drag NICO into the castle in the opening cutscene, were to reappear as enemies. But in the end, the team chose to keep the combat centred around Yorda in the clear struggle of light versus dark. This also helped with hardware limitations, as more complex enemies would have required even more from the PlayStation 2 hardware that the team believed was already being pushed to its very limits. These mechanics didn't emphasise what was important in the game, so they didn't stay. This disciplined approach made ICO what it was. Design by subtraction creates games with focus, with quality ideas and mechanics that all push and pull in the same directions. But it also bucked the trend of popular console video games. 2001 was a year when video games were getting bigger, as almost every year had been, but in 2001 in particular for the mass market, the size and scale of video games exploded. 2001 in many ways was the year that defined the next 2 decades of video games, with arguably the most influential title of the 21st century being released in Rockstar's latest Grand Theft Auto title, now available with not 1, not 2, but 3 full dimensions to explore. Now Grand Theft Auto 3 obviously wasn't the first 3D game, nor was it the first open world game or even the first sandbox game. But it was those latter 2 for many players, and for them, and me a few years later, it was an unprecedented level of freedom being allowed to explore and cause carnage in a modern and realistic world. Couple that with the deliberately provocative themes that drew in punters and gave Rockstar no end of free advertising, GTA 3 took the gaming world by storm. Its impressive sales made it the best-selling title of the year, and this highlighted what everyone could already see to be true. Popular video games were getting bigger. Design by subtraction makes games smaller. ICO was a game about a child protecting a friend he had only just met from shadow creatures with a stick. GTA 3 was released and its hero was mowing down triads, prostitutes and pedestrians in near equal measure. Fumito Ueda once said that he perhaps went too far with his design by subtraction philosophy when working on ICO. Not because he thought it negatively affected the end product, but because it made it a difficult game to market. Video games in the early 2000s needed to be condensed down into snappy paragraphs and taglines for gaming magazines, accompanied by a screenshot or 2 that showed off what the game was. But it wasn't really possible to capture ICO's unorthodox feel in a few words, and the lack of a heads-up display meant that screenshots couldn't easily convey gameplay, and it's possible, at least to Ueda, that this contributed to the game's poor overall sales. Ueda certainly never made this mistake in later works, and went on to say that an art game like ICO would be more accepted in the current market of 2011, and I think it's safe to say that that's even truer now in the 2020s. Though in many ways, this is true as a result of ICO's critical success, and the influence it had on many game designers to create these art house narrative experience games. The core experience of ICO is clearly the relationship between ICO and Yorda, which if you haven't played the game you've probably already gathered from everything I've said so far. In one way or another, almost every aspect of ICO builds this relationship, either directly by affecting ICO and Yorda in the gameplay and story, or indirectly through 2 other methods: upping the immersion of the game to involve the player more in the relationship, or by adding to the game's sense of isolation and otherness that emphasises the relationship by contrast. Yorda is introduced to the player and made important by her necessity. She can open the totem doors. ICO needs her, you need her. Her design as a ghostly young girl trapped in a castle immediately makes her a sympathetic character. Immediately after leaving the first area through the first door, you get the first save point. ICO and Yorda sit down together as the light and ethereal track Heal plays in the background and you save the game. There's the setup. ICO and Yorda together against the castle, and this bond builds throughout the game. The puzzle design forces the player to always be thinking about Yorda and how to bring her with you, demonstrating ICO's kindness as he constantly helps her. Yorda is important to ICO, but ICO is important for Yorda too. The characters move through the castle almost always holding hands. When they aren't, it's usually because you've had to leave her alone while you explore, but you're still thinking about her. Why? Because the game's only fail state, other than falling off a cliff, has been deliberately tied to her. She is what the castle wants, she is what's important. This is emphasised even further in the combat sequences where enemies largely ignore you in favour of trying to steal Yorda. Your goal is never to kill the shadow creatures, it's just to keep Yorda safe. And when you are saving her, it's with the same R1 button that you use to guide her through the castle. You're saving her by holding her hand. The unsettling quiet of the castle and its vast emptiness exaggerated by the interconnected design shows just how alone you are, how isolated from all other traces of humanity. Whenever you load the game, the first sight you're greeted with is Ico and Yorda sitting together in a rare moment of peace. It's just Ico and Yorda. And the tangible nature of the puzzles, the realistic setting, the lack of gamifying features, it keeps you in the moment and amplifies the impact of the story. Everything in Ico makes the bond between Ico and Yorda feel real and important, and 20 years later it stands up as one of the most incredible feats of character building in the medium. And nothing emphasises how powerfully the relationship has been developed than the very next scene. Not just the biggest moment in Ico, but for me, one of the most iconic moments in all of video gaming. When you finally made it through the East Arena and worked your way back through the castle to solve the opposite tower as well, the main gate can now be unlocked, but the castle isn't done with you yet. Even though Yorda has been opening doors all game, this door is different. You can see how it's affecting her as darkness spreads down from her shoulders. When the gate opens and you try to run across the bridge to freedom, Yorda can't keep up anymore, and stumbles if you go too fast. But you keep going, either treading carefully or forcefully tugging Yorda, willing her to move faster. You are so close now. After every fight, every struggle, every challenging climb and locked door, you have made it out of the front gate. You are on the bridge, you are halfway across, you are almost safe, almost free. But the castle isn't done with Yorda yet. In the fourth narrative cutscene, sending out tendrils of energy, it stops Yorda in her tracks. The bridge starts to retreat, splitting in two with Ico on one side and Yorda on the other. After stumbling when the bridge moves, Ico falls off one side, but scrambles back up just in time to leap back across towards the castle. Yorda catches him. It's a clear reversal of their roles from the previous hours of the game, but it's no use. With the Queen's magic advancing, Yorda can't hold on, and with the castle claiming her back, she can't pull Ico up in time, and he falls. But this wasn't all a cutscene. It could have been. Yorda stumbling, the bridge closing, Ico's jump and eventual fall, there would be nothing wrong with that. A cutscene to close the second act of the game and introduce the third. But it wouldn't have been as impactful as what actually happens. When the bridge moves and Ico falls, the game gives you back control, and without hesitation you clamber back up onto the bridge and jump back towards Yorda, back towards the castle. The first focus of the game was always escaping the castle, but that has clearly changed. You were on the bridge, you were out of the castle, you had escaped. You could have tried running for freedom, but it wouldn't feel right if it was just you. Instead, you look back towards the one place that you don't want to be and take a leap of faith. And it really is a leap of faith. At no other point in the game does Ico have to be caught after a jump. This gap is bigger than you can jump on your own, and subconsciously the player sort of knows that, but they do it anyway. This could have been scripted, this could have been a cutscene, it would have moved the story onto the same place and demonstrated what was important to Ico's character and the importance of his relationship with Yorda. But it wouldn't have had the same impact. It wouldn't give the player that moment where they think, why did I do that? When they realise that in a split-second decision, they didn't choose to go away from the castle, they chose to go back towards Yorda. If this had been a cutscene, it would have worked, but it wouldn't have made the most of what a video game can do. That is one of the things that's most important about NICO. The way it used the attributes of a video game to build its story and characters. And as a result, this art game, Ueda's first project as a game director, has had an incredible influence on the development of video games ever since. I've already mentioned that NICO possibly influenced the horrible 7th gen wave of bloom lighting, but overall the influence has been a much more positive one. Many notable games of the 2010s and the late 2000s wouldn't have been what they are today without NICO there as guidance. I usually try to avoid sounding like I'm listing things or segmenting videos too harshly into specific sections, but given that this is going to sound like a list no matter how I write it, I may as well just lean into it. If you've played NICO, you can see how its ideas have been used in countless major video games since its release, both AAA and indie. NICO's mechanics, visuals, non-verbal storytelling and characters are qualities that many developers have taken inspiration from and tried to replicate. And these are just some of the incredible video games and developers that were heavily inspired by NICO. Journey is one of my favourite video games of all time, and you can see the ways in which its design is similar to that of NICO. Visually, the game uses no heads-up display to keep you in the shoes of your character and add no barrier between the player and what's happening in the game. Journey uses no written or verbal communication from the developers to guide the player, only subtle hints through level design and a scripted camera. Your player character in Journey is very much smaller and weaker than any enemies you may encounter, and in comparison to the decaying ruins around you, this character feels small and insignificant, but still of immense importance to you. Genova Chen of that game company once replied to Fumito Ueda on social media to explicitly say that Journey's atmosphere was inspired by NICO, and one other game. Hidetaka Miyazaki, the designer of the Souls games, also talked about NICO being a major inspiration to him, and you can see traces of NICO's sprawling castle in the monolithic settings of the Dark Souls franchise. A single interconnected level that feels like a vast but tangible world is directly inspired by NICO. Staring out across the world and seeing places that you've been and wondering if new places are where you may be going next. That game awoke me to the possibilities of the medium, said Miyazaki in an interview with The Guardian. I wanted to make one myself. NICO was what made Miyazaki want to design a video game. When Patrice Désilets was working as creative director for Ubisoft's Prince of Persia: The Sands of Time in 2003, 4 years before he would also work as creative director on the original Assassin's Creed title, he had his team spend an entire day going through NICO. He had them looking at it, playing it, discussing it and brainstorming. What they liked in particular was how the castle in NICO seems real and you always know where you are, and so tried to implement a similar feel in the second palace in the Sands of Time. When NICO released in 2001, production of the Sands of Time had already started, and yet Désilets still felt it important to take note of what Ueda's debut title had done so well, and feed that into the development of his Prince of Persia game. As Mark Brown pointed out in his video on Design by Subtraction, Ueda greatly enjoyed the early Prince of Persia games, and so Prince of Persia influenced NICO, which then in turn influenced Prince of Persia. Josh Holmes, who worked on Halo 4 for 343 Industries, is another creative director for a AAA game that credits NICO as an inspiration for their work. With regards to Halo 4, he suggests a similarity in just the core relationship between the boy in NICO and Princess Yorda, and Chief and Cortana. That bond they have, that need to be there for one another. Continuing to say that he will likely always be influenced by NICO, probably in ways that I don't even understand, because it's definitely one of the pinnacle moments in my gaming career. Another popular IP to have taken inspiration from Ueda's work is Naughty Dog's Uncharted series. During the development of Uncharted 3, Evan Wells, the president of Naughty Dog, said, "NICO is the kind of game, that linear narrative-driven experience, that we're focused on making right now. Everyone in the office has been influenced by it greatly." It's clear that this inspiration isn't direct. While both NICO and the Uncharted games are linear narrative-driven experiences, Uncharted relies heavily on quality voice acting performances to tell detailed stories, in comparison to ICO's minimal dialogue. Instead, it's details like how ICO designs its spatial platforming puzzles, creates levels that don't feel abstract or limiting, and how it tells a story through those environments. Uncharted, however, isn't the only Naughty Dog IP where the creators have expressly credited ICO as an influence. 2 years after the release of Uncharted 3, Naughty Dog published their most ambitious narrative-driven adventure, The Last of Us. The cues taken from ICO here are more obvious to see. Released to critical acclaim, The Last of Us is a survival horror thriller praised most notably for its storytelling, its characters, and importantly, the relationship that develops between Joel and Ellie. Sound familiar? Combat that made you feel vulnerable, and locations that make you feel lonely, which draws you closer to the characters you control. Ideas used in ICO remastered a dozen years later for a game considered by many sites and review aggregators to be one of the best games of its console generation. Speaking to Polygon about ICO in relation to his work, Neil Druckmann, the creative director for The Last of Us, said, "The main thing I loved about ICO was that relationship. That hand-holding mechanic that helps build a bond. It was the first time I realised you can create something meaningful through interaction, as opposed to just telling a story." This influence from ICO came through not just Druckmann as creative director, but also Bruce Straley as game director too. And here, thanks to a clip I found from an interview with Game Informer, I can let Straley describe his relationship with ICO in his own words.
I tend not to really be starstruck, like Mike Mignola and Ueda-san. Outside of that, it's just I don't. Maybe Neil Druckmann. No, it's like no. It's
How
like
dare you.
It's like. But that was one of those times where it's just like It was the very first game that I played. It basically shaped my entire concept of how core mechanics are built and exploited, and then switched up in a way with context to story, and how those two things parallel each other, and then to come out with an emotional impact that made me cry. I cried. It was the first game that I ever played where it's just like I'm in with the controller in my hand and I'm crying, and I'm just like, a game did this. And that shaped my entire concept of design. And you can see it in all of the games that I've been a part of since, of trying to get its core mechanics. It's building those core mechanics. It's switching up and taking away core mechanics based on story context. You know, it's getting a good arc so that you can play with the mechanics in parallel to this story arc and understanding that stuff. So that's interactivity, man. That's what we can do.
Shortly after this, Straley goes on to mention how he met Fumito Ueda after the release of The Last of Us and was delighted to hear that Ueda enjoyed that game. Another game designer that I found a clip of talking about ICO is David Cage, best known as the director and writer of The Nomad Soul, Heavy Rain, and Detroit Become Human. Cage has been passionate about pushing the boundaries of the medium. At the British Academy Game Awards, when Heavy Rain won awards for its story, music, and technical innovations, Cage criticised games for exploring the same things, for being about good versus bad, and that there are so many other emotions to trigger. It's a mentality that mirrors that which Ueda had while creating the idea for ICO. And if you've ever played any of Cage's games, you'll understand that they have always been unconventional.
What I love with ICO was the relationship with the little girl. Okay, there were some platform stuff and some fighting stuff. That was good. But what I really appreciated at the time was how this relationship with the little girl was established, and how it was maintained through time, and with a nice narrative arc, and how it led to an incredible ending. What amazed me is that he managed to tell this very simple story, when you think about it, in a very elegant way, and with almost no dialogue. So everything was just through imagery and sound and animations, and I thought that was incredibly elegant. And there was a sense of poetry in what he did that is really rare.
Outside of the AAA scene, countless indie titles have found inspiration in ICO. In Fez, creator Phil Fish said that he was inspired by ICO's minimalism and lonely isolation, even relying on Ueda's design by subtraction philosophy to improve his game. In Brothers, A Tale of Two Sons, Ico's hallmarks can be seen in the relationship between the two characters, and it even uses save benches as a direct reference to Ico and Yorda. Joseph Fares, the game's creator, said in an email to Wired that Ico was the starting point and proof that emotions can exist in games, kind of a wake-up call for designers. Thankfully, we are now seeing many games trying and succeeding in doing the same thing. In Rime, you can feel Ico in the level design, the character design and the tone, and even in the release trailer, the young protagonist picking up a flaming stick to swing at encroaching shadow monsters seems like a fairly clear reference. But the effect of Ueda's work even reached beyond the video game industry and into other artistic endeavours. Film writer, producer and director Guillermo del Toro has said that video games have had an impact on his style as a filmmaker, because they use art direction, colour and storytelling in a very pure way, describing games as an incredible storytelling tool that filmmakers should embrace instead of reject. And while his opinion may have changed in the decades since, Del Toro would continue to say that he considered only 2 video games to be masterpieces. One of those was Ico. And if you're wondering what the other was, you only need to look at the other side of the box of the 2011 remaster. It's the MF Doom of video games. It's your favourite game developer's favourite game. Or maybe it's more like Buster Keaton. Once you've played Ico, you can feel traces of it everywhere. It's difficult to overstate the impact that Ico had on the video gaming landscape, perhaps eclipsed in its console generation only by another 2001 release, the previously mentioned Grand Theft Auto 3. But certainly as a demonstration of how you can tell stories and build characters in ways that are unique to games, and as a demonstration of the artistic potential of the medium, then there are very few games that can compare. When you lose Yorda and leave the castle, the game world starts to look menacing. You're in a bad spot. The loneliness that the game has made an effort to invoke the entire time is exaggerated now when you are literally alone. And having built up the relationship with the players, it makes a significant impact now that Yorda isn't here. Throughout the game so far, the interiors have been dark and uninviting, while outside the castle was glorious sunshine. But now that's changed. All of a sudden, the weather is bleak, with rainy thunderstorms replacing the previous sunny day. This was always a key guiding element in the game, the light outside and dark inside reflecting where Ico and Yorda do and do not want to be. In the final section of the game, Ico flips the script, using that literacy you've subconsciously built up of how it tells a story. Ico is outside, but in the dark underbelly of the castle, and the lighter environment is inside. Again, we're being told story through the art. Ico doesn't want to leave the castle anymore, his goal has changed. Now he's trying to find a way back into the castle and back to Yorda. There's one other mechanic which really emphasises at this point in the game just how alone you are without Yorda there. The save points. The shining white couches that you would run to sit on to bank the progress you'd made through the castle. But when you sit on one of these benches, nothing actually happens. The save menu only opens and heal only starts playing when Yorda sits down as well. Without Yorda by your side, you cannot save the game. This final section from the bridge through to the end is only maybe 30 to 40 minutes of gameplay. You can play through it in one sitting, but that idea that maybe you can't save makes simple jumps and platforming more tense than it has ever been. As you move through the underbelly of the castle, you have to find your way through another platforming section, though this time without the need to create an easier path for Yorda. The area under the castles is less built up, just a huge natural cave filled with wooden walkways around great wheels harnessing the energy of the water, perhaps powering the lifts and mechanical arms previously seen throughout the castle. This area contains some trickier platforming elements requiring tighter timing, though the water below is forgiving of errors, and conveniently placed ladders mean you don't lose too much progress. Ascending from this area allows you to clamber further north around the cliffs and walk a precarious path across 2 enormous pipes back into the more deliberately constructed stone castle. It's an area that you may recognise once you climb down from the start of the game and the opening cutscene. The totem door that Ico was brought to by the guards. The guards in that cutscene didn't have Yorda for this door, but instead used a sword imbued with a similar power. And this sword is still there for you to pick up exactly where the guard heads to find it at the start. Using the sword, you open the door to bookend the game, moving into the chamber where Ico was entombed at the beginning, his stone prison still laying on its side where it fortuitously fell. Would have been a much shorter game if that didn't happen. Bookending is a fairly common trope within video games, although obviously I can't really give examples without spoilers. I also feel like I'm a bit of a sucker for it. It seems like such a simple way to either give a game a calming feel of returning home, or to highlight what has or what has not changed. At the beginning, Ico was dragged into this room to be locked away in a stone box, but here at the end he's walked into the same room by choice, magic glowing sword in hand, to save his newfound friend. At the far end of the room you can see Yorda surrounded by shadows. Whether you watch them in open play or walk far enough forward to trigger the cutscene, you see the shadows standing around her in a sort of ritualistic dance, only stopping when you climb the steps towards her. As they move, it's your immediate instinct to fight them off, especially now that you have a powerful sword in your hand. But what you might not notice the first time you play is that these shadows never attack you, and they never really have. The most the shadows have ever done is knock you down to run away with Yorda, but they've already got her. The shadows here are different too. They're not as menacing as those you faced before, they're smaller, more juvenile. These ones look like children. Children with horns. It becomes clear as you fight them away that these are connected to the stolen children, the tombs lighting up with a blue glow as the shadows die. This is what happens to the horned children, and would have been Ico's fate as well. You likely wouldn't have noticed, or at least wouldn't have cared until now, but the creatures you have fought all the way through the castle have had horns too. Is that how they were created, or do these shadows grow? You have no choice but to continue the slaughter. The power of this sword is clear. While Ico had previously made do with his stick, the magic sword turns the shadows into smoke with a single touch. It's only when all the shadows are gone and the tombs are all lit that you can use the sword one more time and travel into the throne room. It's a grand empty space. A mist surrounds 2 stone idols near an empty throne at the end of the room. There's an excellent cinematic moment that occurs here where you'll naturally run up to inspect the empty throne, trying to find a way to progress, but it's only as you turn around and walk back down the steps that the Queen chooses to appear. After Ico demands to know what happened to Yorda, the Queen reveals her plan. She's growing old, but plans to extend her life using her daughter's body as a vessel. She tells you that Yorda is already gone and he should put down the sword and go. From our point of view, at the very least, the Queen is clearly evil, and yet once again she offers Ico a chance to simply leave rather than resorting to violence. Just like the shadow creatures that obey her, she has no interest in Ico now, only Yorda. But of course, Ico's had his chances for turning back, and if he didn't then, he isn't now, leading to one of the few parts of Ico that feels like a traditional video game, a final boss battle. It does seem odd to have a boss fight, especially when the game along the way has mostly been shunning all traditional video game aspects and tropes. But Ueda does absolutely love boss battles, even so far as describing them in Walking with Giants as the parts of games he wanted to get to without the stuff in between. One thing this game always tries to do is tell a story through gameplay, and so while it maybe doesn't feel like it meshes with the previous methodic puzzle platforming, a traditional boss battle does replicate quite literally the fight for Yorda between Ico and the Queen. The Queen sends out waves of magic energy, a spell that will petrify Ico on touch, but thankfully he can hide behind the 2 stone idols mentioned earlier, and one other item: the sword. When holding the sword, Eco is safe, and so the battle is one of timing. When to leave the safety of the idols and sprint to the sword that flies out of your hand with every hit against the queen. One mechanic that I really do like during this boss battle is that the R1 button, which normally turns your camera to Yorda when held, now turns towards the sword instead, as though it's Yorda, or at least her magic, keeping Eco safe. It's not a difficult fight. There's only one dangerous moment with a longer gap to the sword that can be fatally mistimed, but you should in 1 or 2 attempts prove successful in vanquishing the queen. Plunging the sword into her chest, Yorda will never be able to escape this castle. The queen's death sends Eco flying into the far wall, rendering him unconscious. The castle starts to shake. In the other room, the tombs begin to glow, white this time, and lightning bolts resembling Yorda's magic reanimate her, but no longer ghostly pale, dark like the shadows, and like the queen. Yorda will never be able to escape this castle. After Eco's valiant attempt to save her, it's now Yorda's turn to save him. The castle begins to crumble. It's clear that without the queen, this place can no longer survive. Yorda carries him to the boat. He'll leave the same way he arrived. Pushing the boat out of the cave, the Dark Yorda stands there in the water. She doesn't get into the boat. She doesn't even try. Yorda will never be able to escape this castle. Or can she? It's a sad ending. Yorda standing there, turned to shadow, watching Eco float away while she stays behind. It's heartbreaking. But the fight with the queen isn't quite the last bit of gameplay that Eco offers. The castle crumbles, the credits roll, the screen goes black, but then it fades back in. On a long, narrow beach, the game gives you back control. It lets you run Eco around in a space that isn't the bleak prison of the castle. The environment gives you just one direction to go, but no suggestion of why you would go there, and it doesn't answer that question quickly. It makes you wait. And it makes you wait some more. For a long time. Full of wonder and confusion, you run left with nothing else around for over a minute, before finally seeing a shape in the water. Yorda. This ending is deliberately vague. Ueda felt the story deserved a happy ending and offered one to the players if they wanted it. And I did. When you see Yorda turn to stone but you're still in control of Eco, you know the game isn't over, you know that you're still trying to save her. But in that ending cutscene, when Yorda comes back and carries Eco, you know there's nothing you can do. Yorda survives, or she doesn't. And when she pushes the boat away and you realise you didn't save her, that's a sad moment. And as the castle falls apart and the credits roll, it feels like a victory, but such a hollow one. So when the game fades back in, gives you back control, gives you that slight glimmer of hope, I don't know how Yorda could be here. I don't know how she could have escaped. I don't know why she's human again or how she washed up on the same shoreline as Eco. But after everything you've been through together in the game, this is the ending I want to believe. I've seen it said quite frequently that this is clearly some sort of afterlife with both Eco and Yorda being dead. But in addition to that being cliched and just as weak narratively as Yorda escaping the castle by magic, it also doesn't seem to make sense. If Yorda in this supposed afterlife has been cured of the shadow spell and returned to human form, why is Eco still bleeding from his broken horns and limping as he runs? It just doesn't feel right to me. and it's not supposed to be clear. When asked about the ending of Ico and whether he was trying to be intentionally mysterious, Ueda compared it to a haiku, where detail isn't as important as what the ideas spark in the minds of the listener. I can see some people being upset by this post-credit scene, disappointed at not knowing exactly what has and hasn't happened, but that sort of clarity isn't something you'll get from a Fumito Ueda game.
So Ico doesn't die, but he dreams he sees Yorda when he wakes up. Nice.
そういう風に受け取ってもらってもいいってことですね。
Ico is simply an incredible game, and for a game that was originally planned to be released for the PlayStation 1, it holds up remarkably well today, though certainly more so in the remaster than the original. A game that was able to build a powerful relationship between its central characters and between the player and those characters, without having to rely on text, dialogue, or frequent cutscenes, instead emphasising the unique attributes of the medium and telling a story in a way that only a game could. Ico is frequently cited in everyone's least favourite debate about video games as an art form, for the way it used its influential and original design choices to create an evocative and immersive narrative. Even the philosophy behind its creation, design by subtraction, has now entered the video gaming lexicon. And that influence that this relatively small game had is remarkable. This was a Sony published game that failed to sell 500,000 units in the United States, and yet one that without which we may never have got to play Dark Souls or Journey. Ico changed the video gaming landscape. It helped widen the scope of what developers could do and helped demonstrate how you could tell powerful emotional stories through video games. It's a focused and pure video gaming experience that even 20 years later, few other titles can live up to. I feel like, as I'm writing this video, most likely the only way the majority of people would get to play Ico is through PlayStation Now. Given that Ico released on Sony consoles that are now 2 and 3 generations old, for most people those consoles aren't sitting around in your living room anymore. And while it's cool that the remaster is still accessible on PlayStation Now, that makes it a single-player game that requires a stable internet connection to be enjoyable. But if you can find a way to play Ico and never previously have, then even with all the spoilers throughout this video, I think this is a truly iconic game that is well worth playing and experiencing firsthand. And while I still don't think there's a chance of this happening, what are Bluepoint Games up to after bringing Demon's Souls to the PS5, because a 20th anniversary next-gen Ico remake sounds pretty good to me. But of course, as well as inspiring others, Ico was a springboard for Fumito Ueda to pursue other projects. His next idea was a very different game, with an expansive open map instead of Ico's narrower linear design, and one that greater showed his love for boss battles. This project was given the working title of NICO, though that name would change before release. Ueda's second game released to even greater acclaim, and just as Ico was one of the most influential games of the generation, his second release would be widely considered one of the best. And that game is, of course, a story for next time. Hey, if you watched all the way to the end of this video, then thank you. I don't know exactly how long this video is going to end up being at this point, but based on the number of pages this Word document is, I imagine it's going to be a bit of a time investment. So hopefully you enjoyed it or found it interesting. Ico is one of my favourite games and I've been meaning to complete this video for a while now. I actually started writing this in May last year, but decided to finish up one short video instead, and fast forward a year and a half later, I've only just got back around to it. As I suggested at the end, I do want to write a similar sort of video for Ueda's second game that you may have noticed I've deliberately not mentioned by name for the past X minutes. Gotta give Ico its own space. But I certainly won't be making that video anytime soon. There are far too many niche indie games that nobody's searching for that I want to give my thoughts on first. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video, subscribe if you did, like the video, all that stuff, and hopefully I will see you in the next one. Goodbye.